Alright friends, we're back to cover Venus in another episode. This one is about Venus and the sign of Aries. If you have this in your birth chart as a birth signature, this video will apply, and it also applies to the current transit of 2025 where Venus is going to station in the sign of Aries at 10 degrees, move backwards into Pisces, and then forward to cover its shadow degrees until it passes that 10-degree mark, and eventually it makes it back to its lovely home of Taurus. And if you guys are interested, go back to my last 4 videos. I've talked extensively about Venus in the sign of Pisces and this retrograde. So we're going to shift our focus mostly on Venus in the sign of Aries. And with that said, let us begin. Okay, one of the first things I want to bring to you guys' attention is that when we talk about the switching of planets from a water sign to a fire sign specifically, we generally say that these planets are going through a particular kind of challenges. So let's say you have Venus at 27 degrees to 29 degrees of Pisces, or 0 degrees of Aries to about 3 degrees of Aries. That planet is switching signs from water to fire and is considered to be in a critical degree. In Western astrology, they call this anaretic degree or degree of fate. In Vedic astrology, the Gandanta point. And one of the differences between the Western concept and the Eastern concept is, in Vedic astrology, they say 3 degrees before an ingress to the next sign and 3 degrees after. In Western astrology, is about 1 degree before and 1 degree after. So in Western astrology, if you have Venus at 29 degrees of Pisces or 1 degrees of Aries, the planet's in that critical degree. In Vedic astrology, if it's at 27 degrees of Pisces to about 3 degrees of Aries. Either way, if you guys actually pay attention to your chart transits, a lot of you will feel it. When a planet is changing that cusp line and starting to go to the next sign, if you have built a sensitivity in terms of physical, psychological, and environment shifts, you'll notice that the planets have a different kind of a feeling. And when they're making that transition from water to fire, you can really feel it. We're going from a receptive mode of being to a very inceptive mode of being. So the difference and the contrast is very sharp. And in a sense, this critical degree, or the Gandanta point, is highlighting a sense of urgency or a crisis, or just a culmination of an energy that just needs to have a shift now. And generally what they signify is emotional turmoil, certain kind of challenges that come up specifically related to that house. Pay attention to the house where, for example, Venus is sitting, where Aries is in your chart. So it's working itself out through the themes of that house, the people related to that house. So those are the urgent feeling one gets that, hey, I need to really work through this. And if this isn't someone's chart, if you have the signature in your chart, you have Venus in Aries, it's indicating certain kind of karmic lessons that one needs to learn, some sort of knots in this life that the person needs to untangle and untie. And what would the tangling of Venus, for instance, be in this life? We have to look at what Venus's significations are, right? So these are knots related to love, relationship, and maybe the concept of self-worth, because now it's in the sign of Aries, so we have to take the symbols of Aries into consideration too. So there's going to be a lifelong struggle for a person who has this as their natal signature. In the transit, we're going to grapple with them as knots that are not so tightly bound to each other. But there is a knot that we're supposed to work out, especially since there's a retrograde and all of these points of the chart are going to be hit 3 times. So there is something we're supposed to work out. So this is something important to keep in mind, because if you have this in your chart, this is a very significant and an important factor. And another thing to consider, at these early degrees of, let's say, Aries, where Venus is transiting and it's only going to get to the 10-degree mark and then it's going to move back. In traditional astrology, a kind of an age range has been designated to the planet. So from 0 to 10 degrees, there's a kind of an immaturity about the planet. It's like being a child. And then from 10 to 20, you're going through adolescence to adulthood. And then 20 to 30 degrees, you're going from adulthood to your advanced ages. And the energies have a very concentrated and a directed kind of energy or focus or attention between 10 to 20 degrees. It's like being an adult. You know what you want. As a child, you kind of have temper tantrum when you want to have what you want to have. In old ages and advanced ages, you might become indifferent to a lot of things that you thought were important. But in childhood, We have to kind of think about Venus right now with a lot of energy and with no sense of direction, because it's going from that 0 degree to that 10 degree where it's going to station and start its retrograde motion. So that's another thing to keep in mind. The ways energetically and in terms of how much energy we have to deal with this, we got to take these kinds of concepts into consideration. And another thing I want to briefly touch on is the concept of signs. It's really important to understand what we're talking about when we say a planet is in a certain sign. Like, what is a sign? We know what a house is. It's very self-explanatory. A house is a domain of life, a sphere of life, and each sector of the chart pertains to a segment of life almost. So we've got like the parts of life that has to do with the self, the private aspects of life, parts that have to do with other people, and then our public life. But the signs have a particular function relative to the planets, and it's important to understand that. And one of the ways to think about signs is that they are a mode of operation. They operationalize the planets. They're kind of a framework that the planets have to abide by the rule. In a way, every planet that goes into whatever sign, they've been given a script of some sorts that this is how you're supposed to act. It doesn't matter what your character is. It doesn't matter what your nature is, what your element is, what your style is. This is the script. This is how you're supposed to act. This is what's accommodated here. So in a sense, the planet becomes the actor. The sign provides it the script, and the sign shapes how the actor can act in that house and how it's able to express itself and engage with others, engage with itself and with its environment. So in some ways, the sign is providing a lens or a set of instruction for the planets that come into their sign, dictating to them how you are allowed to express yourself here. So it's kind of a modulator or a filter of some sort. Now, when we talk about houses again, it's very straightforward. It's like, it's this domain of life. It's your 10th house. We're talking about your career and your public life, and it has to do about fame and then about your father. So we understand, we clearly understand what sphere of life we're talking about. But when it comes to signs, we also have to remember to have a few components. To interpret a sign and a planet in a sign, we have to understand these components related to the sign. And one of the first things that we have to consider the sign's elements. So we got the 4 elements: fire, air, earth, water. So fire gives it this dynamic feel. Earth makes things grounded. Air makes things more intellectual. And water makes things more emotional. So right away, you can see the script is changing. This is or the director's asking you, give me that scene with more emotion, be a little bit more playful. So that's what the elements are asking the planets to do in a very basic way. We'll talk more and get more into depth, but I'm just giving you guys the background and the groundwork of what we need to consider. Then we have to consider the modality of the sign. So we got 3 of them: cardinal, mutable, and fixed. And this is basically dictating pace and approach. So the sign is telling the planet, if it's a cardinal sign, hey, you can initiate and you can choose a direction and move that way very decisively. Or it's going to ask the planet to be more persistent, like a fixed sign. Or it's going to ask it to be more mutable, which is adaptable and being a bit more agile, freedom to move. Then another thing we have to consider with the sign is the ruler's influence, because every planet will have 2 signs except the sign of Leo and Cancer, which are the sun and moon. They're a pair, so we can treat them that way. But the ruler's influence is super important when we want to understand how a planet does in a sign. So this is technically saying the energy of the ruler of that planet will dictate to this other planet that's sitting in the sign how it can be supported and how it's allowed to act. It's almost like the planet that's sitting in that sign is a guest to someone's house, and that house has a landlord. And the landlord, like you as the landlord of your home, you're going to dictate to every guest that, hey, take your shoes off when you come in. We don't put our feet on the table. So this is kind of like the kinds of things that they are doing. They're creating a kind of an expectation from who is sitting in their sign. And another thing we have to take into consideration, one of the last things, we have to consider the planetary relationships, because some of the planets have a greater affinity and friendship, and some other planets are almost like enemies, the way that because of the dissonance between their symbolism and what it is that they're trying to do. So the sign is going to have a great resonance to that planet too and how they operate. So if the ruler is not a friend and the sign has a lot of dissonance, that planet and that sign is going to suffer. If they have a lot of resonance, they're going to do great. They're going to be comfortable. They're going to be supported. So these are some of the factors that we have to keep into consideration before talking about Aries and Venus in the sign of Aries. Sending you much love. Till next time.